Now everyone bear with me here, but have we ever seen Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000 in the same room together at the same time?
Hi, Squidward. I'd like you to meet my cousin Stanley. We're related.
There's two of them?
Hi, I'm Krona the Harlequin, and with the arrival of Warhammer The Old World, something I've been following for quite some time now, I want to take this moment to discuss what Warhammer Fantasy factions have their equivalents in Warhammer 40,000. Or moreover, I should say, what Warhammer 40,000 factions have their roots in Warhammer Fantasy. Because as we all know, Warhammer Fantasy came first, and is the franchise that built Games Workshop. So as such, I think we all deserve to show it a level of reverence. Also, realistically speaking, this is one of the only ways I'll get to talk about Warhammer Fantasy, considering the fact that fantasy videos don't do that well in the 40k community space. Funnily enough, one of my worst ever videos is actually a Warhammer Fantasy video explaining the Age of Three Emperors. But aside from all that, let's dive into this topic because I think it's a very interesting thing to discuss. However, before we get into that, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video, and please subscribe if you have not already done so. Now without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start off with the biggest and most obvious one. The Empire of Man is obviously the Imperium of Man. Now, this is because, yes, it is an empire comprised of, get this, men. But it's also because it's the main faction that is almost entirely human, and has a very similar aesthetic. Densely populated, industrial, scientific, but not so much so. Maybe not the most progressive and high-thinking society, but definitely the one that can keep itself on an even keel, with a level of trade, prosperity, poverty, corruption, and internal problems that we can see in the Imperium of Man. It's a really interesting one-to-one, especially since the Empire of Man is effectively like the Holy Roman Empire. It has that dirty Germanic aesthetic, but that level of dirt and grit is still very well replicated in the Imperium of Man, showing that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Furthermore, both the Imperium of Man and the Empire of Man are fairly diverse places in regard to the makeup of their mortal troops, because you will get Imperial Guard regiments from all over the place. You could have cold Arctic Vestroyans, or Catachan jungle fighters, or Talarn desert raiders, and all those things. And you can see those similarities in the Empire of Man, wherein you can have people from the north in Kislev, or the heart of the Empire itself, or some of the further flung reaches to the side. And this can be seen in the Total War games that feature the Imperium of Man as playable, wherein you can see their list of heroes being very diverse and coming from a whole myriad of places. And pushing forward with the Imperial Guard line of thinking, it also should be noted, both the Imperial Guard and the Empire of Man are mostly known for their infantry. They are by and large mechanized armies. You see, while the Imperium of Man has obviously all the tanks, the Leman Russ, the Malkador, the Baneblade, the Wyvern, basically everything that can be put on tracks and can shoot things, the Empire of Man also has similar things, albeit to a less technological degree. They have things like volley guns, rocket batteries, mortars, great cannons, and even steam tanks, gyrocopters, and war chariots. However, the Empire of Man is not just this purely industrial, early modern setting. You see, it also has groups of people who have very specific knowledges that the Empire itself could not survive without. And of course, I'm talking about wizards, or in the case of the Imperium of Man, the Adeptus Mechanicus. You see, these people have their own levels of study, their own sets of skills, and their own communities that they dwell within and practice, but that are again still part of the Empire and highly necessary. You even get interesting characters like Balthasar Gelt, who I guess you could honestly call the Empire of Man's Fabricator General. Now, the thing is, the Adeptus Mechanicus obviously is not using magic, they're just researching technology, but it sure as hell feels a lot like magic, and they do seem like a class of priests more or less. I don't think anybody's gonna really argue with me on that. Honestly, the biggest difference would be that the colleges of wizards in Warhammer Fantasy have a much greater understanding and a firmer grasp of what they're talking about and what they're doing than the Adeptus Mechanicus, who are effectively the Empire's tech support. Now, I was supposed to end this section 2 different sidetracks ago, but the more I think about it and the more I look into it, the more keeps coming up, so this will be the last time I sidetrack and go on to another topic about the Empire of Man / Imperium of Man, and it's regarding religion. Because both the Imperium and the Empire worship a mortal human hero who has effectively become a god in their personal consciousness. Now, Sigmar Heldenhammer becomes a god in a more literal sense, in Age of Sigmar. That's his true proper ascension. However, he's more of a backseat figure of a god in fantasy, much the same way as the Emperor is in Warhammer 40,000. Not really a god, but definitely a figure that is worshipped and has power. That sort of great hero become worshipped figure type deal. And this directly translates into two other groups in the Imperium of Man who do have their origins in the Empire. That being the Inquisition and the Adepta Sororitas, you know, the Sisters of Battle. Now, starting with the Inquisition, they're a lot more varied in Warhammer 40K and I think are much more well-beloved and much more interesting. However, in Warhammer Fantasy, they're nothing to sneeze at, especially since they are the prototype. These being the Witch Hunters. You know, you've seen the memes. By the hammer and the empire, I abjure thee! And while the Inquisition's jobs are much more varied and much more Byzantine and multifaceted and much more rich lore-wise, Witch Hunters are a lot more straightforward, but they're still really cool. People who hunt down darkness, taint, witches, cultists, that sort of thing, and kill them. The next on the list is the Sisters of Sigmar, and these are what you would expect them to be. Battle-hardened women who fight for Sigmar and live in their own special area away from the rest of most of society. You know, your typical badass battle nuns. However, there's a fun reversal here, because Warhammer 40,000 didn't get these from Fantasy. It was actually Fantasy that added them as a nod to 40K. You see, Sisters of Battle were first added in 1997 in the 2nd edition. However, these were added in 1999 to Warhammer Fantasy, in White Dwarf and in Mordheim. Mordheim, I believe, was one of those smaller strategy games, in the same way Necromunda is a smaller version of Warhammer 40,000 with a specific theme unto itself. I should note, however, Sisters of Sigmar never really took off as a mainstay of the canon, however, I feel like they are worth mentioning. And I would also like to cap off this section by stating that this was definitely the easiest comparison next to the Elves, but I will say it does get a little more complicated when you delve into Space Marines, because the Empire of Man doesn't really have a direct equivalent. While you could argue their equivalent would be the knights that are in service to the Empire of Man, like the Reiksguard or other such units, that's not really a direct one-to-one because the aesthetic just isn't there. They're just very well armored. I would say they are more like the Tempestus Scions, if anything. However, there is something that's close, and that would be the Warriors of Chaos. Because the Warriors of Chaos, as depicted in Warhammer Fantasy, wear very heavy plate armor that is adorned in spikes and symbols and is very distinctive and striking, and they have these really iconic helmets. Now, here's the thing. Those are only for Chaos. So in terms of Loyalist Space Marines, there really is no proper one-to-one equivalent in Fantasy. But now that I have mentioned them, let's talk about the Chaos equivalents. Because, as you can imagine, Warhammer 40K gets its perceptions of Chaos and how it works from Warhammer Fantasy. There are still the 4 ruinous powers. Chaos Corruption still works in a similar way with mutations and temptations and all that sort of thing, as well as their own specific portion of the world. While in 40K, Chaos has their central point in the Eye of Terror, but in Fantasy, they have the basically north and south poles of the world, as well as the surrounding areas, that are known as the quote-unquote realms of Chaos. You can find the battlefields of Khorne or the gardens of Nurgle there, and instead of hordes of traitorous cultists or planetary defense forces that have been turned to Chaos or defected guard regiments, you are going to have Warriors of Chaos. That being those heavily armored knights who are favored by the gods and are the closest analogy to Space Marines. So Chaos Space Marines have their roots in Fantasy, but Loyalist Space Marines don't really. And there's also the Northmen, that being Viking-like tribesmen who live in the north and are subject to chaos. They are slaves to darkness, as they are said. You know, these people are also called the Lost and the Damned. That's where we get terms like Slaves to Darkness, the Lost and the Damned, Warrior of Chaos. They all come from Fantasy. Out of everything in this video, that's the thing with the most clear one-to-one. Chaos. The nature of it, how it works, who follows it, why they do, how it corrupts, the gods of chaos, the demons of chaos. Now, aside from the fact that demons in 40k are going to have a little more of the 40k flair to them, and Chaos Space Marines are obviously much more distinct than just Warriors of Chaos, there is still the clearest connection. However, a connection that's maybe not as clear is Bretonnian Knights, because many people have actually debated this online, what their closest equivalent is. Someone on a forum, I think it was Daka, actually said that their closest equivalent was the Tau. If you look up Tau equivalent in Warhammer Fantasy, I think that post will come up somewhere. I can't seem to find it now, but that was there, and no, I don't think that's correct. Now, what most people saw as the equivalent to Bretonnian Knights, now, most people's interpretation of what the 40k equivalent of Bretonnian Knights is are the noble knight houses. You know, those ones who pilot the knights and have that very aristocratic hierarchy and sort of basically have those chivalric values of dueling and familial honor and the name and heraldry and all that. That's one I absolutely agree with. But you might think, well, that doesn't really make sense, because they are their own faction in fantasy. Bretonnia is its own nation, and it fights with the Empire of Man. And they're very different because Knight Houses are just a very tiny subset of the Imperium of Man. It's just so much smaller in Warhammer 40k. Well, you have to understand that's not uncommon, and the next big example of that comes from Ogres. The Ogres in Warhammer Fantasy have their own kingdoms and their own religion, and they're their own faction altogether. One that is actually very popular because of that absolutely banger trailer from Warhammer 3 Total War. Yeah, you know the one. However, their equivalent in 40k is again a small subset of a subset, that being Ogrins, the abhuman mutants who serve in the Imperial Guard and are generally speaking huge, burly, not very intelligent, and very fond of food. Now, they're not as fond of food as they are in fantasy because, again, in fantasy, that is their entire religion. Ogres in Warhammer Fantasy seek out food and eat all the time, and will even eat other people, and will eat anything they can get their hands on, living or dead, because that is part of their religion. They worship a hole at the center of a mountain called the Maw, that also has, to their mind, an insatiable appetite. And they will sacrifice some of the food they want to eat and throw it in the hole. Their sacrifice stew, as the song says. However, in Warhammer 40k, they're not their own faction, they don't have their own religion, the Maw is not a thing, they're just big, dumb, and hungry guys. However, they are absolutely loved in Warhammer 40k, especially since they came out in Darktide as a main playable faction. Well, not even faction, 4 playable classes really. That's even smaller than a faction. However, their dialogue is so charming, and people love them so much in the lore because they're really friendly and nice and just want to protect the little ones and eat the rations. You know how it is. People just love them because, again, big and friendly. Which is actually quite different from how they are in fantasy, which is big, hungry, and terrifying because they will eat you and destroy you for money. They're mercenaries or their own armies in fantasy, but again, in 40k, they're just a small, tiny subset of the Imperial Guard. And on this vein, I would be remiss if I didn't shout out the Beastmen, because in 40k, Beastmen are just human mutants. They're an offshoot of the main human strain, albeit one of the more stable ones, and they live on the fringes of Imperial society, usually ending up in very unpleasant places, either having to eke out an existence in dangerous manufactory jobs, if their society allows them to live at all and doesn't just kill them at birth, or being allowed into certain regiments in the Imperial Guard if they're lucky, because not all of the Imperial Guard will take them. However, it is nice to see them around. They have their own interpretation of the Imperial cult, they have their own little culture, and they generally don't do much. However, many of them do end up aligned with chaos. This is different from Beastmen in fantasy, who are far more ubiquitous, and are more or less their own race, who are known as the Children of Chaos, as opposed to just being an offshoot of humanity. Furthermore, you're not going to see Beastmen in fantasy fighting in the Imperial army. They are wholly aligned with chaos, and will always be so, because again, the name, Children of Chaos. They're more concentrated in the northern wastes as opposed to just being in the unders of hives. Now that we have most of our bases covered here, let's pivot away from humans and towards Xenos or fantasy races. And the first most obvious one to come to mind are Elves. You see, Elves in Warhammer Fantasy are divided into 3 distinct groups. I'm sure that sounds familiar. That being High Elves, which are equivalent to Craftworld Asuryani, Dark Elves, or Druki, which are equivalent to the Drukari of Camorra, and Wood Elves, which are obviously the Eldari Exodites who live on the Maiden Worlds. Now, let me touch on the Wood Elves first. They are much, much more important and influential in Warhammer Fantasy than they are in Warhammer 40k, wherein they are damn near non-existent. We hear smatterings of them here and there, sure, but nothing ever really comes of it. However, Wood Elves in fantasy have a lot of sway. There are large forested areas that they control that people are just afraid to go through. And moreover, they created the entire Bretonnian faith as a way to manipulate them, because the Bretonnians worship the Divine Damsel, or the Lady of the Lake. It's their main battle cry. For the lady. And it's what people like about them so much, because, you know, there's obviously that whole Monty Python, "The Lady of the Lake gave unto me Excalibur." And it turns out those peasants were right, because strange damsels coming out of lakes distributing swords is not a proper means for a system of government, because the Wood Elves crafted the myth of the Lady of the Lake in order to get the Bretonnians to be their defenders and their meat shield. People don't go past the Bretonnians because the forests are right behind them, so they can just sit there with a giant wall of knights unwittingly doing their bidding. The Exodites could absolutely never accomplish something like that. Also, furthermore, their backstory is more interesting because when the Elfin Empire set upon itself and tore itself apart in civil war, in an event known as the Sundering, as opposed to the Great Fall of the Eldari by the birth of Slaanesh that we know of in 40K, they were actually colonists in these further eastern provinces who were abandoned when things all fell to ruin and regressed to this more feral, guerrilla tactic natural state. And that brings us to the other side of the pond, where we have High Elves and Druchii. Now, the Druchii are not as much like the Drukhari in that they don't need to feed off pain in the way the Drukhari do, because Slaanesh doesn't have an inherent claim on their souls, just has a preference for them. So when they torture and do all these horrible things, they do it because they like it, and they get a thrill out of it. Also, it should be noted they're much more piratical than they are in 40K. You see, the Drukhari are more focused on this must torture and cause suffering in order to survive thing, while Druchii are just more formal pirates and are more in line with Dark Elves that you see in other fantasy settings. Furthermore, they are more inclined to worshipping Cain, the war god, as opposed to Asuryan, that the High Elves are worshipping. And that's another thing. The gods of the Eldar and the Elves are similar, if not exactly the same. Asuryan, Isha, Vol, Cain, and so on. Now, I'm kind of breezing through this because this video is starting to get longer. I need to get working on shorter videos because I just have a lot of time constraints. So let me sort of power through this. The High Elves, for their part, or the Asur as they're called, were, much like in 40K, creations of a race known as the Old Ones, who had access to a lot of knowledge and magic that was passed on to their race, the Asur. And to that effect, the Asur had a place to live that was very idyllic and very magical and all that. That being an island continent called Ulthuan. That name should probably sound familiar. It sounds like Ulthwé and Ulthran. And speaking on Eldrad Ulthran, I guess you could say that he and Teclis occupy a similar narrative space in the same way the Emperor and Sigmar do, or Karl Franz and, I don't know, maybe Rabute Gilliman. Now, while the Eldar of Warhammer 40,000 have their craft world ships which are scattered about and going their own separate ways, as well as developing their own distinct identities while still all being on the same side, they are different from what the Asur have in fantasy, because they are still on that continent of Ulthuan. Now, this continent, during the Sundering, which was a civil war that saw the split between the High Elves and the Dark Elves, had large parts of it sunk, and now those remaining parts are divided into 10 kingdoms with, again, their own personalities and ways of doing things, but who are all also on the same side. They are a diminished people, but who still have a pretty idyllic lifestyle. However, I will admit, it is way easier to be a High Elf than it is to be an Asuryani. Furthermore, the Druchii have something similar to Camorra, Camorra being the foreboding and harsh realm that the Drukhari live in within the Webway, leaving them distant from the rest of the setting but not entirely isolated, which is a dark and horrible place to be that you never want to find yourself, because if you do find yourself there, it's probably in chains. And that place for the Druchii is Nagaroth, their city on the far western side of the world. This is the quote-unquote new world in the setting, and has a lot of things that don't really show up in 40K proper, like the Lizard Men or the Amazons, and I would not say the Sisters of Battle or Sisters of Silence are particularly equivalent to the Amazons. And furthermore, Nagaroth is also visually similar to what we see of Camorra. You know, tall spires, black stone ramparts, spikes everywhere, vast slave plantations, that sort of thing. Also, one thing I find funny is that since the map of Warhammer Fantasy is analogous, or at least based on the map of our world, we can locate where things are in fantasy to where they are in real life, and Nagaroth, for its part, is basically located around northern Manitoba or Saskatchewan, which, yeah, that checks out. Now, moving past the knife ears, let's get to the dwarves. And this one is a little more interesting, because the dwarves in Warhammer 40,000, or the kin of the Leagues of Votann, are not exactly dwarves. They're just an offshoot of humanity. They came from humans during the Dark Age of technology, when humanity spread out across the galaxy, and then adapted to life in the core of the galaxy, where they developed a strong independent culture, mining, their own identity, that sort of thing, and have thus far been separate from humans' affairs as the Imperium spread. However, in fantasy, they're more in line with what I like to call the Tolkien standard. By that I mean the basics you expect when you think dwarf. You know, they're their own separate race from humanity, and predate them by quite a bit. They're one of the older races. They have sort of a harsh enmity with elves because they've come to blows in the past. They're a diminished society. They live in their holds in the mountains. They like mining. They like gold, grudges, yada yada yada. Honestly, I would actually hazard to say, much to the chagrin of many people watching this video, that dwarves, aside from a few characters like Gotrek, are some of the least interesting parts of Warhammer Fantasy because it's just that. Dwarves. There's not that much to them. Like I said, Tolkien standard. If you plopped a character like Gimli from Lord of the Rings into Warhammer Fantasy, you could probably do so as a direct one-to-one. However, if you made him a Votann, you would likely have to do a fair amount of fiddling. Not that I would know, however, because it has been over a year and a half since their release, and we have not gotten a single proper Votann novel or narrative beat as of yet. Honestly, I'm starting to think GW just forgot. There is, however, one thing that makes dwarves in Warhammer Fantasy very interesting. And of course I'm talking about Chaos Dwarves. And these guys have no equivalent in 40k. Not yet, at least. Because these Chaos Dwarves ended up separated from their kindred and turned to the worship of a minor chaos deity. Of course, there's a lot more to it, but that's a story for another video. And it has given them their own cruel culture, their own unique aesthetic, a very Mesopotamian one, and the ability to use magic that other dwarves in fantasy don't really have. Granted, this comes with the interesting caveat of dwarven sorcerers eventually turning to stone. Now, back in my video about the future of Vashtor, it was one of the very first videos on my channel, and one of the ones that propelled me into being a proper theory and lore channel as opposed to just a podcast. I predicted that we could possibly see Chaos Votann sometime in the future, where instead of worshipping the minor deity of Hashut, they would fall in line with Vashtor, the entity looking to become the 5th Chaos God that we saw in the Arcs of Omen series. Something I think would be really cool. And another thing people think is very cool, and actually want to see in 40k, is Skaven, the chaos-aligned rat men with a very funny, hilarious way of talking. And again, a lot of people have been saying, hey, what if Skaven were in 40k? Wouldn't that be cool? Well, they actually kind of are, but not in the way you would think. You see, the same narrative space that Skaven fill in fantasy is actually occupied in 40k by the orcs. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, there are already orcs in fantasy. Well, you have to understand, those are only similar to orcs in 40k on the most surface level. They're big, they're green, and they're warlike. However, they're not equivalent to what we have in 40k, because the orcs in Warhammer 40,000 are closer to Skaven in terms of their technology. You see, in fantasy, they're just that, orcs. They have heavy, scrap-made metal armor and big blades and whatnot, but the Skaven have guns that look like they're made of just garbage and weird technology that realistically should not work because they just slapped warpstone and a bunch of metal together to make a giant wheel thing. Orcs are much similar, except instead of warpstone, they just believe that the hunk of garbage that is vaguely shaped like a truck will work, and so it does. Their guns are also, again, made of garbage more or less. And orcs in 40k are known for their very distinctive and fun way of speaking that people love to mimic. You know, de boys love to crump de gits and whatnot, unless de oomies come by, in which case, gotta smash them and take all their bits. It's basically the Birmingham Cockney to the Skaven's London crackhead. Furthermore, orcs in Warhammer Fantasy are only isolated to a small part of the world map, out there in the east, in their own little tribes where they fight amongst each other and have a region of the world where people simply avoid unless they have to. However, the Skaven are the most numerous race in fantasy by far. They live underground, in a series of tunnels and underhive networks below the civilized world, and vastly outnumber every other race put together. And it is said that with their technological capability and numerical superiority, if they ever all unified, they would very easily take over the planet and sweep away all other races. However, they can't, because Skaven society is so fractious and chaotic and prone to backstabbing and just nonsense, coupled with their own self-serving cowardly nature, that causes this to not ever be possible. As such, they remain the underclass who exist only to really be kicked around by the other, better, more cohesive races like humans and elves and others. So, despite the massive threat they pose, realistically, they are more or less a joke. That should all sound familiar because that doesn't apply to the orcs of Warhammer Fantasy, it applies to the orcs in 40K. Their shitty technology gives them an edge that would let them sweep aside the Imperium and the Eldar and everyone else, coupled with the fact that orcs in 40K are confirmed time and again to be the galaxy's most numerous race, even outpacing humanity. However, lo and behold, nothing ever happens because they spend most of their time fighting and warring amongst each other because it's just what they do, and it stops them from really conquering the galaxy. So I think you can see what I'm getting at here. Orcs are only similar to orcs in fantasy on a very surface level. Big, green, like fighting, you know. But narratively speaking, they occupy the same space as the Skaven. And now last but certainly not least, let's talk about the Tomb Kings, who are pretty obviously the basis for the Necrons in 40K. However, when you really start doing research, as I did for this video, you find out that those similarities are generally more surface level. Yes, they are skeletal, yes, they are Egyptian, yes, they have their dynasties, yada yada yada. However, it should be noted that the history of the Tomb Kings and their homeland of Nehekhara is quite different from the Necrons and their old empire. You see, the Necrons had a horrible time of it from the very beginning, being born on a planet near a star that was dangerously radioactive, and having to deal with a war with the old ones that they started and lost pretty severely, and a deeply fractious culture to begin with. However, Nehekhara was actually sort of a golden age. It was an empire that encompassed most of the old world, and was doing really well. However, over time, they would overextend, and eventually fall into infighting and strife when times of plague came, seeing a great reduction in their territory, coupled with a pretty devastating drought. A drought that would come to an end with the rise of Settra, the main leader of the Tomb Kings faction, who you could consider kind of like the Silent King. He would actually sacrifice his own son to bring an end to the droughts and reunify the fractious Nehekhara region, thereby bringing about a new golden age. However, we all know the story of the Silent King. He saw that his people were suffering and could never stand up to the old ones while simultaneously dealing with their very short lifespans, so he cut a deal with the Catan in order to have his people made into the stainless steel and all-powerful Necrons, who would never die, but at the cost of their souls. Realizing his error after the fact, turning on the Catan after the old ones were defeated, and then themselves going into hibernation rather than fight out a brutal war against the Eldari. However, the Tomb King's descent into immortality was far different because Settra was too selfish and greedy to ever really give up his power. He never wanted to. He wanted immortality. So, he would have his priests discover the secret of immortality, or at least something like it, extending his life and then assuring him, oh, after you die, we'll be able to resurrect you, so don't worry. And he would eventually pass, and then successors would take the throne, then start demanding that they be buried in elaborate tombs in the same way as Settra, although not as big as his. So, there would be more and more necropolises popping up all across Nehekhara, kind of like how the Necrons across their domain had those tomb complexes that they now slumber in. Eventually though, the priests of Nehekhara would discover immortality, but only use it on themselves, becoming known as the Lich Priests because, while they were immortal, they would still waste away into skeletons. Eventually though, a priest and heir to the throne named Nagash, well, heir to the throne after he murdered his brother, would take power of Khemri, the largest city in Nehekhara, and start draining all its resources to build a giant black pyramid, bigger than even Settra's tomb. Now, he was an absolute tyrant and an extremely powerful necromancer, and again, he forced all of Nehekhara into poverty by waging war for resources for this pyramid thing. So, they would all eventually rally against him, the Lesser Kings, and eventually even the mortuary cults who he had been a part of initially before taking the throne. they would start raising undead armies of their own and would, in one final battle, push him back. However, he would flee in the end. Now, here's where things start to get a little complicated, and I'll say this about the Tomb Kings: they have a much deeper set of lore than the Necrons do, because the Necron tier lore you can really sum up pretty quickly. There was the war in heaven, they lost, then they went to sleep, yada yada. It's interesting, but it's not that much. The lore of the Tomb Kings, though, gets very more detailed, going all into Nagash making alliances with vampires and him becoming a god, and it's a lot, and I honestly need to do more research on it if I'm being clear. And I would like to actually make a full Tomb Kings video because, hey, since they're one of the main antagonists in Warhammer The Old World, now's probably a good time for that. They're very interesting, and I don't think I can do them justice in just this video alone. So I think I'm gonna cap it off here, but I will say there are some interesting parallels between Nagash and the Catan, that being traitorous gods who were turned upon and supplanted. Now, I will say this: I did do a Warhammer fantasy video once before, one about the Age of Three Emperors, which is when Warhammer The Old World is set, and it is actually the single worst performing lore video on my channel. That's very unfortunate. However, I would like to cover more fantasy videos in the future because I think it is an interesting and under-discussed setting. All that said though, I hope that this video was a cool introduction into fantasy races, especially if you're coming at this from a 40k background. But what do you guys think? Do you find these races really interesting, or do you prefer the 40k versions? Do you think I was right in all my assertions, like in that orcs are Skaven instead of just orcs? Or that there is no proper equivalent to Tau? Maybe you think Tau and Lizardmen are the same because they're both blue. As always, I would love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, and until then, I will see you in the next video.